What's the message our lives convey? What is it that we transmit to others? The prophet Isaiah asked the people of Israel, what message do you think that they convey to Yahweh, to God, by all their religious observances? And the prophet says, God is not fooled by their seeming to do all the right things, fasting and praying and boasting that they know God's way. What God sees, and what God sees is always tinged with that word reality, is their violence, their selfishness, their greed, the conditional nature of their obedience, doing just whatever suits. What does God require? That they convey a different message to the world altogether. So listen to today's reading for any similarity with the prophet Micah and what he said God requires of his people.
Isaiah 58, verses 1 to 9a. Shout out, do not hold back. Lift up your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, to the house of Jacob their transgression. Although they ask guidance of me day after day and say they delight in knowing my ways, as if they were a nation which had acted rightly and had not abandoned the just laws of their God, they ask me for righteous laws and delight in approaching God. Why should we fast if you ignore it? Why humble ourselves if you take no notice? In fact, you serve your own interests in your fast day and oppress all your workers. Your fasting leads only to wrangling and strife and lashing out with vicious blows. On such a day, the fast you are keeping is not one that will carry your voice to heaven. Is this the kind of fast that I require? A day of humbling oneself such as this, a bowing of the head like a bulrush, and using sackcloth and ashes for a bed? Is that what you will call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? Rather, it is not this the fast that I require, to loose the bonds of injustice, to untie the knots of the yoke, and set free those who are oppressed, tearing off every yoke. Is it not sharing your food with the hungry, taking the homeless poor into your house, clothing the naked when you meet them, and never evading a duty to your own kinsfolk? Then your own light shall break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up quickly. Your righteousness will be your vanguard, and the glory of the Lord your rearguard. Then, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry to him, he will say, Here I am. In this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And a witness from the Gospels is from Matthew 5:13 to 20. You are the salt to the world, and if salt becomes tasteless, how is its saltness to be restored? It is good for nothing but to be thrown away and trodden underfoot. You are light for all the world. A town that stands on a hill cannot be hidden. When a lamp is lit, it is not put under a bucket, but on a lampstand, where it gives light to everyone in the house. Like the lamp, you must shed light to others, so that when they see the good you do, they may give praise to your Father in heaven. Do not suppose that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to complete. Truly I tell you, so long as heaven and earth endure, not a letter, not a dot will disappear from the law until its purpose is complete. Anyone, therefore, who relaxes even the least of the law's demands and teaches others to do so will have the lowest place in the kingdom of heaven. Whereas anyone who keeps the law and teaches the others to do so will rank high in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless you show yourselves far better than the scribes and Pharisees, you can never enter the kingdom of heaven. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Our lives convey messages all the time, and I learnt the hard way that sometimes we may not transmit the message that we intend. I started training for the ministry at a very young age. I entered Parkin College straight from school, and my first 2 years were not illustrious as a student. I did I won't tell you how poorly I did. But I knew that I'd have to front up to the governors of the Park and Trust and explain myself, and they would want to know what was going on. And this didn't happen until the beginning of the new year, at the end of January, maybe beginning of February, and an appointment was made for me to meet with the governors. I was very nervous about this, and thought I must get there in good time, and set off from the place I was holidaying in Port Noarlunga. You know, in those days you went to Port Noarlunga like it was, a long way away. And I was riding my dad's Beezer Bantam, which broke down on the way, and I had oil all over me, and I was dressed, I was still in holiday mode, I had shorts on, and I had this flaming red splashed t-shirt that I thought was just marvellous and would wow all the girls. Not quite sure about that. But I knew that I'd have to get back and change properly for the interview. But I was running late. And I went to the college and I was going to change my clothes, but then where's the meeting? Where are the governors meeting? Have I got the wrong day, for goodness sake? Oh no, that meeting's held at the right time, but it's in town. It's at the Stowe building, where Pilgrim is these days. I didn't have time to change. I just had to get there and be late and turn up as I was. I knew that wasn't a good start. Well, the upshot of all of that was that I was duly informed by the governors, that perhaps it would be good if I went out and did something else for a while and then came back to the college. Got myself sorted out. I was devastated. I was sure that I was called to be a minister of the gospel. And I spoke to one of the governors, this was allowed, who was a member of our church, and said, can you just give me a bit of feedback? And they said, well, Jonathan, the thing that put them off was that you sat there smiling the whole time. What do you mean smiling? Apparently, when I'm nervous, I have this silly grin on my face and conveys completely the wrong message. And it was for that reason, more than anything else, that they thought I should be stood down, I think was the word used. And of course, it was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Sometimes I hear people say, the problem is a lack of communication. There never is a lack of communication. It's happening all the time. The question is, what's being communicated? Or what's being communicated by not being communicated? Do you get the point? As disciples of Jesus, what is it that we communicate, or maybe do not communicate, to the world around us? And it all depends on who you are. Today we continue reading from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, that section in the Bible known as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, if I had my way with the lectionary, we'd have this every year. Well, we kind of get it again in Luke, but not quite in the same way. It's the core teaching of Jesus. And last week, you were here, those of you who were here, it was the Beatitudes that was the basis for the reading. The Beatitude, which stress that it's the quality of life that counts. It's not the quantities of the thing you have and consume. But the Beatitudes are also about a new social order. There's a communal dimension to the Beatitudes. They're about a different way of relating to each other that's based on profound human respect for each human person. That's actually based on what you'll see at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Its climax is based on profound love. I like to call it the other world in the midst of this world. I think that's the thing about we Christians. We actually live in two kind of realities at the same time. And the interesting thing is that the one that's out there that, people call the real world, where presidents can issue forth executive orders, which seems to be the all-powerful prevailing reality of life, in fact can actually be transformed and changed by this other world in the midst of it. But let's wait for a bit more before we go down that road. What the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount are about the lives of those people whose lives are turned outwards, beyond their own needs, where people beyond live, as they used to say, beyond themselves, their own wants and desires, who are attentive to the needs and the social circumstances and the spiritual hunger of other people. In this social order, the humble, the meek, are the ones who count, are the ones who inherit life, the world. That old meek, blessed are the meek, they'll inherit the world. They will be the ones who know about the fullness of life. And then with seeming pinpoint accuracy, Jesus uses two images, two metaphors to point us in the direction of being those who live beyond ourselves. Salt and light. Salt. You are salt, and I like the Revised English Version's way of putting it. You are salt to the world, for all humanity. And the qualities of salt. At our earlier service this morning, we did this as a discussion. We could all list them. First of all, people said, the first quality of salt is that it adds taste. It adds flavour. It's got a savouring quality. I'm one of those who cannot have fish and chips without salt. Is that the same for you? Now, we now know about the dubious quality of too much salt. My great-uncles on my father's side all died in their early 60s of heart attacks, and because they had hardened arteries. They piled on the salt. I watched my father doing it when I was young. Salt on everything. Don't do that. And yet, you have to have some salt, or else you die. Someone shared this morning, they remembered the time when they had to have salt tablets when they were doing sports. Hands up anybody who used to take salt tablets. Quite a few of you. Right, okay. Do they still do it? I'm not quite sure. But because salt is so essential for life, those societies where salt's scarce, they value salt. In fact, salt became at one stage so valued that it became the actual currency. The word salary comes from the word salt. Even so, salt is a wonderful metaphor for those who transmit the flavour of life. And like the action of salt, you don't have to have a lot of it. It's almost imperceptible, but it can make all the difference. But then salt is a preserver. Someone said there wouldn't be a British Empire unless they had salted beef for all those ships to go around the world for people to feed on. Salt was a preserver, especially before the days of refrigeration. Salt is a cleanser. Salt undoubtedly has other uses. Someone asked this morning, is it true that salt can lose its saltiness? Well, yes, it can. It can lose its saltiness. The Romans loved bathing, and they had baths all over their empire. You may have seen the baths in Bath. All those baths had lots of salt put into them. And they noticed after a while that the taste or the effect of the salt wore off. The saltiness did actually disappear. But what does it mean to be salt to the world? I mean, I'm amazed at how easily and how frequently put other people down. How quick people are to criticise others with harsh words, suddenly dismiss them, call people idiots, no-hopers. And the one I think is the worst of all, calling people a waste of space. I mean, isn't that awful? And of course, this goes along with the bullying that happens particularly now in the social media, where people say he or she is not who they actually are. Being salt means, I think what it means, being in contrast to that, being the presence of affirmation. Knowing that people aren't perfect, knowing that there's two sides to everybody, still be able, in spite of what imperfections people may have, and whether or not you like them and their personality, to still be able to transmit to them a sense that you respect their humanity, that you honour who they are as a person, even though you might want to engage in a discussion about their behaviour. Not to start with judgment, not to judge that leads to discrimination, but to start being the presence of those who are able to say yes to life. And I've noticed the effect of people who have that kind of presence amongst people where they're commenting to people in such a way, words of affirmation. You know what happens in a community when it happens? The whole spirit rises. And you can almost smell it, feel it, that in this place, affirmation is transforming how people feel about themselves, each other, and about life. I could explore the other effects of being salt to the world, adding zest to life. I'm reading an old classic called Cold Comfort Farm, written in the night. Anybody read that book? They also made it into a film. It's written in the 1930s, I think. The young woman who has to go off and live with relatives on this farm called Cold Comfort Farm. Can you imagine being called Cold Comfort Farm? There was no comfort on that farm. The way people related to each other, they lived in a mess. The farm was literally a pigsty in every respect. She goes there and she adds a certain kind of zest, and again, kind of affirmation of the people who are there, and gradually people change, the situations change. And I think the thing about people who are salt to the world in this sense is they're the ones who see possibilities. Now, sometimes there's not much to encourage us. You know what I really miss these days? Is Alistair Cook's letter from America. Do you remember it? It was on, I think, the BBC, then the ABC for, 40, maybe even 50 years. Alistair Cook each would comment on what's happening in America. And quite often he would be quite aware of anomalies and some ridiculous things and injustices that occurred in that country, but he never did it cynically. I wish he were around now to comment on what's happening in America. What would he say now that Trump's in the White House? And a similar image, of course, to this is the one that Jesus used later, where he talked out to his disciples and says, "You'll be like the leaven in the lump, the transforming presence." Well, we've talked about salt and whether its quality, whether the saltness can lose its quality, and it can. But what happens when Jesus says, what Jesus warns and says, really, be on guard, you don't lose your saltiness. I think that's a warning to not go to sleep, to slip into unawareness, into self-satisfaction, and think like Isaiah's audience, we are the lucky ones. Always be the transmitters. Now I'm going to read a poem, one of my favourite poems, and it's a poem by D.H. Lawrence, and because it's D.H. Lawrence, it will mention the word sex. So I'm warning you. But it's one of my favourite poems and was read at the funeral of the late Brian Robins. As we live, we are transmitters of life. And when we fail to transmit life, life fails to flow through us. That's part of the mystery of sex. It's the flow onwards. Sexless people transmit nothing. And if, as we work, we can transmit life into our work, life, still more life, rushes into us to compensate, to be ready, and we ripple with life through the days. Even if it's a woman making an ample dumpling or a man a stool, if life goes into the pudding, good is the pudding. Good is the stool. Content is the woman with fresh life rippling into her. Content is the man. Give and it shall be given unto you is still the truth about life. But giving life is not so easy. It doesn't mean handing it out to some mean fool or letting the living dead eat you up. It means kindling the life quality where it was not, even if it's only in the whiteness of a washed pocket handkerchief. And Jesus said, you are to be light for all the world. What's the difference about this metaphor? I think whereas the salt has its effect in it, there's something imperceptible about it. But the property of light is to shine. And in Jesus' day, it took just one candle to be sufficient for the room in the house to be adequately lit for people to live their lives. Its simple glow filled the house. And of course, when light shines, and we are to be the ones to reveal the light, it will show up that which is hidden. And in this regard, it's a dangerous effect. Because when that which is hidden is showing up, you'll get a reaction, you'll get a response. Take whistleblowers. We've even had to invent new laws in our country, with some resistance, I might say, to protect people who are whistleblowers. Whistleblowers who will point and reveal something wrongful and shameless that the banks have been doing. Something wrongful and shameful that sometimes government departments do, or when they let out the care of asylum seekers to other agencies. That's why investigative journalists, I believe, are the modern day prophets, because their role is to cast light on that which was hidden so it can be named and dealt with. But light has its own special positive glow. It has its own transforming effect. The power of the Christ event in our lives can transform us from being petty to being profound, from just loving comfort to being able to risk new things, from being self-depreciative to being able to delight in our self-worth, from holding back and being fearful to letting go and embracing the consequences, from frantic activity to being able to live in a calm, mindful way. And of course, it means that we can be empowered to be the ones ourselves who expose injustices, which then allows people who've been put down, humiliated, to be empowered and be liberated to live their lives. Well, this is so different from the way what Christine called last week the Beatitudes of what most people think. You know, blessed are the pushers, they get on in the world. Blessed the hard-boiled, they never let life hurt them. You could add a few more. You know, blessed are the bullies, for, you know, they'll get their own well and to hang with the rest of you all. No. That's neither blessed nor does it the route to happiness. But what's the danger? To hide it. can it really be hid? How do we hide the light that we can transmit to others? Well, fear of being hurt, succumbing to the pressure to conform to the world's expectations, or we can slip into a cheap moralism and hide in legalistic ways and live the life of everything oughter, or we can even use others for ulterior motives. Light is extinguished, my friends, though, only by not living beyond ourselves anymore, by ignoring the needs of others, for their need to bask in the light of grace and love. The light is hid if we insist on our own preference that everyone else sit in the dark. And so, to live beyond ourselves means refusing to get caught in a state of games where we always have to take the credit, but as always as appropriate. When questioned, when people ask, why do you do that? You're able to give an answer to what it is that motivates you. That we are the ones who point to the very core reality that gives life to the world, and that's the profound love of God. And thus we become what I call living symbols, like a sacrament. We convey, we transmit that profound love is the reality, and that divine mercy is commended to all others. So friends, what is the message that your life conveys to others? Who are you really? May we as a community be those that transmit the salt and light to the world that has the marvellous transforming power that God sends us out with. Amen.